Hello, everyone. It's me again, this time coming back with Paul Moore. We've done some interviews in the past. This time we're going to do a series of small, just kind of sections or nuggets, really about so much of the conversation that's been coming up around AI, but in particular, if anyone knows Paul Moore, around developer practices, because he's the one who delivers the Certified Scrum Developer, the Advanced Certified Scrum Developer, and now a BDD course, a Lean Engineering course, and more. So definitely pertinent to come and kind of sit a little bit and revisit because there's so much happening with that. So I'm going to start at the highest level. Just from your perspective, Paul, you've been in the industry, I mean, how long? Really before Agile Manifesto, you've seen trends before, and maybe a little bit for the developers, like what do you see happening? Just at the 30,000 foot view, 40,000 foot view, why it matters, what's happening with AI, just your take on that.
Yeah, so I won't age myself here, but I definitely am as old as personal computers, if not a little bit younger or older. It's really been that as the computers are getting networked, as the computers are getting more powerful, as we're talking to each other, the capabilities are amazing.
Mm.
But at the core, and I mentioned this in my classes, is that as a developer, I enter my program one key at a time. And if I get one keystroke wrong, everything breaks. And that's changing a little bit with AI, but I still think there's fundamentally, we've got to have all the different pieces spelled out correctly. And that's what we've got to watch out for, is that we got to make sure that we know what we're saying is what we intended to say and not what the computer is going to interpret the wrong way.
Which is huge. So on that note, one metaphor you gave that I really liked, that I hadn't heard you mention before. Tell me the $1 million metaphor.
Yeah, so I like that Kent Beck, one of the founders of extreme programming, he talks about conferring with the genie. AI doesn't know what it's talking about or what it's thinking of. It just knows what it can parrot back to us based on all these conversations that it has consumed. And if you think about any of the genies in classic literature, they will interpret our requests almost to the T, whether it's what we wanted or not. So the $1 million question is, if I tell the genie, hey, give me $1 million, and then a pile of cash appears in front of me, how do I know that there's actually $1 million bills there? How do I know that they're real bills and not counterfeit bills? How do I know that they haven't just been stolen from a bank and deposited in my house here? There's so many things that we have to think about around the general want to make sure that we get the system that's actually going to serve our needs.
Yeah, I think it's a really great warning, cautionary tale, a little bit about that. It's easy to assume, and I was sharing the same experience I had when someone gave me that metaphor about a large set of documentation and, oh, we must have captured everything instead of actually really kind of walking through it, which is the benefit of, say, writing user stories on cards, et cetera. And I think given the large amount of code that can be just automatically developed, people probably do feel like, oh, that's so much faster, so much better. But we don't really understand that. It's a legitimate concern. So some of what I think, what we were talking about before, and I'm going to tie this back to the Certified Scrum Developer class, which really is like the XP practices, software craftsmanship, et cetera. Maybe you could walk us through. So for example, let's take unit test. You gave an example for, hey, I could create unit tests, right? But at the same
Yeah.
time, maybe someone needs to really understand how to evaluate that. Maybe you could unpack that a little bit from that perspective.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I'm watching out for is that when I learned unit testing and test-driven development 25 years ago now, I thought it would be the way things are done these days. And we haven't seen that really, broadly adopted out there. Most people don't apply it the way it was intended to be. And so with unit tests, yeah, you can have a bunch of unit tests in place and your coverage may seem like a high number. So you've got the mythical 80% target that you're shooting for. But that's no guarantee that you're actually getting the behavior of the system captured as something that will trigger a unit test failure. We want to make sure that the unit tests are detecting when the behavior of the system deviates from what we want it to do. And unit tests in and of themselves and a high coverage number aren't going to tell you that.
Yeah. So for me, it's a little bit like an opportunity, and it's a mixed bag. To Paul's point, it would be good to understand in unit tests. I think some people might have the understanding, but to your point, are we really practicing it? And this just came up earlier today, talking to an engineer, and they said, I'm trying to debug this. And in my mind, I was classic, like it's either 2 hours or two weeks, who knows? If you,
Yeah.
if you, if you had good unit tests, you'd know right away exactly where it broke. You would know as soon as you checked it in and tried to compile or run it. But for those that don't know, they might think, well, great, I can now begin using unit tests with less time and effort, perhaps. So I think that that's a good thing. But back to your point, like, well, how do we evaluate those? So I think for those who might be thinking, hey, AI can help us in these areas that I think we should be doing, walk me through maybe in the Certified Scrum Developer class, they're going to walk through some aspects of that. And then maybe you can kind of tie that into the relevance of AI, both as a helper and an aid, and also the cautionary thing.
Yeah. Well, and it comes down to the understanding of what the unit test is trying to accomplish. And this actually came up in the class last week where we had a good suite of unit tests and we had a chunk of code. And the class had seen the code for the first time that day. So they were trying to understand, what is this code doing? It's not very well named. It's not very well factored. And one of the secrets is that, well, just comment out a line of code and see what unit test breaks. And when you've got a really good set of unit tests, that's going to start telling you something about what that particular line of code does. And so I could see that in a situation where you generate unit tests on an existing body of code, then you want to start doing some of these things like mutation testing, or like we did, manually just modifying the code and seeing, are the unit tests picking up that change in the system.
See what breaks. It's kind of an aside, and we didn't talk about this before, Paul, but it reminds me when we're doing some of our own mob sessions internally, that you still have that mindset, like, well, just break it down to the smallest piece of this work.
Yeah.
Run that and see what AI might build with that, whether we're vibe coding or whether we're doing something with automation, like with N8N. It's always like, it's a mindset, like do a small chunk incrementally, see what works. Or you said, comment out a line, see what breaks, still step by step.
Yeah, and that's why I'm really kind of blasé about what AI is going to do, because I think at its core, instead of me generating the code, now this other thing's generating the code. But how do I know I'm making good forward progress and the resulting solution is actually what I want it to be? And in the old days, pre-Agile, it was like, write all the code you can think of and then start testing it. And hopefully your testing is going to uncover the problems. But with Agile, it was really, here is this big problem in front of us. What's the smallest piece that I could get in front of a user and get their feedback on? And I think it's going to be the same thing with the AI. What is the core happy path, or whatever metaphor we want to use? What is the core functionality of the system that we want to see working, and then build on top of that?
Yeah. And I'm going to pivot maybe just 10 degrees off that. You brought up something a few weeks back that I thought was really good. If I'm remembering it right, you're basically saying the benefit of AI for a developer, one of them would be that it wasn't even about the AI generates all this stuff. You had said the benefit of AI is it's actually making us pull requirements forward and think about it more beforehand, right?
Ideally, and I think that goes back to the revolutions in cycle time that we saw. You know, in the 90s, it was pretty common to have a project that lasted a year or more. You know, I worked on projects that took 3 years, where it was like, we're not going to deliver something to the customer until 2028. It's like, okay, that's the way we do it. And that, didn't work. Surprise, surprise. And so along comes Agile, where it's like, well, can we do that in a month?
Yeah.
And back in the late 90s, early 2000s, a month was pretty aggressive. But now we've got companies that are doing it in days. And the drag there is like, well, it takes a day to write code. So what I think we're starting to see is, what is the smallest thing that we could do in the next hour?
Yeah.
And rather than having us generate the code, it's like, what is a small piece of requirements? What is a small functionality that we could deliver, get the AI to do the heavy lifting, and then have us confirm that behavior?
Yeah. So here's what I love. It's almost like the mindset there is yes, a developer, programmer, engineer might know several different languages, or that might be a specialist in particular, but you're actually pointing out, like, their understanding of what we're trying to build and to deliver is actually really the critical thing.
Yeah.
And bringing that forward.
Yeah. I think one of the big changes that we're going to see is that developers are going to have better understanding of the domain. That in parts of my career, it's pretty easy just to skate through, and it's like, product owner, business analyst, you tell me what we're building and I will interpret that into code. But now, because some of that interpreting into code is somebody else's job, that is the AI, we're going to have a little bit more empathy with what the customer's up to.
Yeah, which is big. If I look at XP, or certainly Scrum, but like, part of it was get us closer to the customer, get us closer to the voice of the customer. Yeah, and I think that's good. It's almost coming back to the roots.
Yeah. Well, and that's another question I ask in the class is like, who here has talked directly to a customer of your software? And very rarely do I get somebody that said, yeah, I know the user of my system.
Yeah. So I want to take one specific example with Scrum that you gave that I also thought was really kind of insightful. And that is, obviously AI changes the way that we're creating product, creating working software. And one was the product backlog refinement meeting. And you said, like, look, if we have the ability to generate code or we're doing vibe coding, that could turn into an interactive kind of session with essentially the customer, voice of the customer. Talk us through a little bit why that might be important and how that might look.
Well, the purpose of backlog refinement is to make sure that we've got a good enough understanding of the product backlog item, the user story, whatever we call it, that we have a good enough understanding of that so that we can complete it in a 2-week sprint. I mean, that's one of the core reasons that we do refinement is so we don't have a requirement come in and we find out, oh, it's too big. We can't finish this in a sprint. So taking that to its logical conclusion, it's like rather than waiting for the sprint to give us the feedback, is the thing built and correct? What is the smallest thing that we can do during refinement that we could actually build it, determine it's correct, and then potentially ship it? So it is going to take that story slicing from something that'll fit into a 2-week sprint boundary to, what can we get out in the next day? What can we get done by lunch?
Which I love it because it came up again recently with a client about essentially they were asking for something, took a lot of work to put it together. They show it to them by the end of the week. And like, yeah, that wasn't what I was thinking. It's the same thing about I'll know it when I see it. And to me, that interactive nature of like, well, then let's walk through it. And it doesn't have to be static wireframes. It could be interactive prototypes that actually work. Now, we're not going to put that in production. We're not, but at least we confirm this is what you're asking for. Okay, I think we have an idea what that would look like to build.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you say we're not going to put it in production, but time and time again, we see that does get into production. And that's where we start getting called in as consultants to help them take this, this beta concept that took off.
Yeah.
That, now they've got to support, maintain, and grow.
So that leads to another area. It reopens possibilities for me because I can't think of a time that we haven't been talking with a client that technical debt was a concern of theirs. Certainly at the dev level, but I've seen even managers like, no, we get it. So in your opinion, based on what XP brings to the table, some of those practices, or maybe even AI in the combination, what do you think that this might be a new opportunity to revisit what we're looking at with technical debt, or why that might matter for devs and AI?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that's one of the exciting areas that I'm hearing people exploring is that they can take a system that's got some not quite up to snuff code, but they can measure it using a linting tool or a static analysis tool. And then they just set the AI loose and they say, hey, given this list of things that are not good that the other piece of code discovered, go through them, fix them one by one, do a commit. And I'm hearing stories that people are taking their debt backlog and just solving them in a day.
Wow.
So that's something where if you've got the confidence, and especially if you've got the unit test in place or the testing around that system, if the code behaves the same after the cleanup as it did before, that's probably a valid cleanup. But that also gets back to, do you as a developer know what good code looks like? Can you quantify that in some way? It's not going to be a open the editor and look at it and go, I understand this. It's going to be something else. And that's where we're going to have to bring in some of the other tools, the visualization tools, the charting tools, the graphing tools, whatever they are, to help us understand this larger system that's not just going to be a small piece of code.
Excellent. Yeah, because it can be overwhelming with those large ones. But for me, it's the first time in a while I felt like, wow, there actually might be hope that people can get themselves out of that situation of feeling like we're just inundated with technical debt.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that, I think, in my opinion, that would definitely tie into BDD. So maybe for those who aren't familiar, just a quick overview of what is BDD and maybe what's covered in that class and why that might matter for what you're just now talking about, right?
Yeah. And you've been saying BDD without defining it. So let's start there with its behavior-driven development as opposed to test-driven development. And the simplest way to think about it is test-driven development is really focused on the code and what the developer's doing, interacting with the system. But what we found as developers is that the business folks didn't want to look at code, didn't really understand the code. So we wanted to talk about them, the behavior of the system in an automated, testable way. And that's what behavior-driven development came about from, is that we can specify how is the system going to behave. We can run that as automated tests and get the feedback, yeah, the system's working or this behavior is broken.
And I love that because for me, unit test is like, it is doing what I asked it to without errors or problems. Is that what the client wants? Now we're looking at BDD, right?
Yeah, and another distinction there is that the unit tests tend to be focused more on the smaller internals, and the BDD, almost by its nature, is coming from the outside, testing the integration of the entire system.
Nice. So it seems like those, obviously both are very helpful.
Yeah.
And especially if we're doing things, we're speeding it up.
Mm-hmm.
I know when we were going through a recent example mobbing, I think it might have been just this week, but it's so good because it did create some code for us. And then your first response is, let's take a look and walk through the code and
Yeah.
see what it gave us and make sense of that. What is a very powerful tool, but to your point, do you understand what it is and what it's doing? There might be another way that teams are checking that.
Yeah, and I think that's what we've got to watch out for is that the code it's generating is based on code that's out there. And we know there's good code, we know there's bad code, we know there's malicious code.
Yeah.
So just because on the surface it looks like it's doing the right thing, we've still got to watch out for is it pinging back home and sending out little nuggets of information that we don't want escaping.
Right, right. When it's going to give us something that looks correct or structured correct, in the same way ChatGPT might give us an answer that sounds very intelligent. You'd made a point earlier, but it's actually not, right? So
Yeah.
giving us something, to your point, who knows where it's pulling it from, but it's going to maybe look clean, structured, who knows, but is it actually running and performing the way people want it? Seems to be a concern that you're having.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's all based on probabilistic things that it's interpreted as it's scoured the world to come up with its databases of when I say that I want to go to the pet store and it's like I want to go to the pet store and buy pet supplies or take my dog in for grooming. It's not like I want to go to the pet store and get an oil change.
Yes.
But that could crop up maybe, and it doesn't know. It's just going based on what's likely to occur as each token is interpreted.
Yeah, yeah. It brings back the memories of the glue pizza.
Yeah, or how many rocks are helpful.
Right. So, if you were talking to a dev team who's saying like we're looking in the AI, these are conversations we've had recently. In general, what's your guidance or recommendation? Hey, we're getting some. Let's just be honest, Paul. We're
Yeah,
getting pressure to use AI. We're
yeah.
getting pressure, right? What would you advise them to be thinking as they move forward in some way with AI? Pros, cons, all that. Top of your mind.
Yeah, I think the big one for me is like what is fundamental versus what is likely to change.
Hmm.
And what we've been talking about, the iterative development, the quick turnaround, having the confidence that you're building something that is what the customer wants is going to be core of the experience that we as developers are going to have. I haven't felt like the churn in the solutions out there as I have like in the early days of JavaScript, when the web first started
Yes.
getting brought out, that what I know today, probably not what I'm going to need to know in 3 months, and for sure a year from now, who knows?
Right.
And we were just talking about like, is prompt engineering even a thing anymore? Yeah, maybe a year or two ago that was even a job title, but I don't feel like it's that there. So chasing that prompt engineering may not be the right way to go, but understanding what prompt engineering is about and
Mm-hmm.
how you interact with the AI at the LLM, I think that's going to be the thing to focus on.
Yeah, yeah. I think we're going to see more and more. We're seeing this complete integration across. Doesn't matter what the platform is, what they're enabling devs to have or to use. And it's funny. It is like
Mhm.
a JavaScript days when there's like a new library. It felt like every few weeks or months, and now that pace is even faster than that. If you're talking to the folks that are saying, why is this relevant? Maybe you can tie it together a bit more holistically on the importance of being a good software craftsman or the XP practices as a tool, sets of tools in your toolbox. I know you got that great image of the giant mechanics toolbox
Yeah.
and the pairing with AI, whether that's, you mentioned unit testing, BDD, could be pair programming. People are using AI for
Mhm.
pairing. Collectively, maybe you can kind of weave that together a bit more about maybe this is the time to revisit software craftsmanship practices before you just run at 100 miles an hour to implement AI everywhere you can as a developer. Why should I care? Why
Yeah,
does that matter?
yeah. I think the big one is that if you're not used to collaborating with someone, whether it's pairing or mobbing, you're not used to taking what's in your head and expressing it verbally. You're not used to articulating it, and that's definitely a skill that you can work at and get better at. But most developers, I still don't think are there. And we talked about now with the AI as a partner, being able to express what you want verbally or as words is going to be a very different skill that most developers haven't been, thought of having at all, let alone being a key requirement to working with the system. And I've even seen demos of people verbally conversing with their computer and that picking up their audio input. And now that's how the communication's going. So I think there's going to be a level of being able to express yourself with precision and catching when the AI is not interpreting your instructions correctly.
Yeah, great point. Because that our interface to work with AI is verbal, and if devs aren't used to verbally communicating as much, then yeah, it kind of puts them in a challenge. I was kind of, and this is a little bit of an aside, so you get no heads up warning on this one, but you're making me think. Describe in your own words what makes a great software engineer, great developer? What sets, because obviously we've seen these numbers, like if you're
Yeah.
in the top 10, you're as good as several different developers. But in your own experience, what do you think of those traits that make for a great engineer?
Well, I don't know if I can express what makes it great, but we talked about that engineers tend to think a little bit differently. That even if AI is the end all be all to all of our problems, not everybody thinks the same way.
Yeah.
And as an engineer, when I'm thinking about the world, when I'm driving somewhere, I'm kind of looking at traffic patterns and gaps in the flow in front of me. And I'm like thinking a couple of steps ahead. I'm not just reacting to, I need to get over eventually. It's like, no, I can see the traffic on the right has stopped. So I'm going to switch to the left lane and get there a little bit quicker.
Mhm.
It's just having this visibility of the bigger picture when we think about the architectures and not just the implementation details. And I think that's going to be some things that are probably going to resurface. We had the big UML revolution in the 90s that kind of disappeared over time because a lot of that upfront work went away when we could start building systems faster.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the documentation in the UML was in reaction to, well, we're not going to see the results of the system for months or years. Can we talk about it on paper today?
Yeah.
Well, now we can get the whole system in an hour, but how do we start understanding what that system looks like? And
Mhm.
again, that goes back to the tools, the supporting um, features of the system, and not just if I punch this button, what does it do in reaction to that? What is actually going on under the hood?
Yeah.
And I think engineers have a lot of that. Let me lift the hood and see what's actually occurring there mentality.
I like that. It reminds me of one of my earlier projects I had to just take over from someone else who had to move off as a consultant. And most of my time was spent trying to undo the fact that they had just used the wrong platform, something that couldn't scale. And that was the beginning of like, oh, that's not just being able to develop. That's when, the idea about being a solution architect or technical architect made more sense. But I was like, we cannot continue to move you forward in this platform. It's not, obviously not sustainable. That's why you're having it fail like multiple
Yeah.
times a week. And yet the person could build something and put it out there in the beginning. Be like,
Mhm.
this is great, but they did not see the bigger picture. And then now here goes 9 months of investment, and they realize like, oh, we're kind of in a corner now. So I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's really significant.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of, we've had any number of companies that want to do a rewrite. They've kind of boxed themselves into a corner with their current implementation, and a rewrite is like no guarantee that it's going to be any better, especially if you're using the same people under the same constraints.
Yeah.
So how can we help them incrementally dig themselves out from under that pile of debt?
There's one more piece. You mentioned that about no guarantee that's going to be any better. And in some instances, you could even say, like, did we learn anything from those mistakes? That came up recently from something I was listening to that I'd mentioned to you about whether it's AI or the XP practices, the software craftsmanship, whatever that is, the space to learn. And a few companies and the people at those companies who they have a good practice around learning. Could you speak to that? If I'm a manager, tell me why there's this importance about giving some slack to learn, whether that's refactoring, all these different things that you can name any, but maybe you could just kind of comment on this isn't a nice to have. Maybe right now with AI, it's a need to have.
Yeah, it ties into a little bit of that misperception that junior and senior is a linear path, that coming out of school, only A and B. And when you get through your career, C, D, and E. It doesn't go A, B, C, D. It kind of goes like, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? When did I first hear about it? And that's why I, as a senior engineer, I don't worry about pairing up with a junior. Somebody coming out of school has got a completely different viewpoint of the world than what I've got myself. So being able to learn from them is going to just benefit me, and being able to impart some of the things that I've seen is going to help them. And it goes back to that there's more than I can ever know. There's just more anything than I can ever know about a computer. I'm currently reading a book on supporting and releasing to production, and it's just like it's getting down to the transport level of how packets are arriving. And it's like, I kind of have heard of that, but I don't really appreciate how that works. And yet, we just saw a DNS outage with Amazon Web Services the other day. And it wasn't because somebody wrote an if statement wrong. It was probably something down at the DNS level that blew up. So,
Wow.
yeah, we just have to be aware of what's out there. And when the time comes, it's not like I'm going to become immersed in everything about that problem, but how do I get myself up to speed really quick?
Yeah,
And the best way that I've done it is pairing up with people, mobbing up with other teams.
I agree. On the job with someone, local knowledge, tribal
Yeah.
knowledge. Yeah. Um,
Solving a problem that's in front of you that matters.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll work on the
Yeah.
priority thing. So, kind of extrapolating a little bit more from that, if I'm a engineer developer, I'm concerned about moving ahead in my career and growing. And yet you've seen a lot, not just who you've worked with as a developer in those different, but certainly coaching and the training classes, all of that. If you could pick one or two, like this is probably the most common skill that I think is an opportunity or a need or an area. Like I'm a dev, just your average developer, just trying to move forward. What would you say, like most commonly, without knowing you, I would guess it's one of these two, three things as a problem or a gap that you might see. What would you recommend that they, if you just tackle one thing or look into one thing, skill, knowledge area, mindset?
Yeah. So, I mean, we've got kind of a self-selecting audience that comes to the certified Scrum Developer class, which I made a comment that the people may be working in a more modern language like Ruby or Kotlin or something. They don't need the basics. But when I get people coming to our classes, I kind of see that they don't think about the problem in terms of what is that smallest nugget of value that I could deliver.
Mm,
They're kind of thinking more in terms of if I type in a nonsense number, if I type in an invalid value, if I'm throwing invalid input at the system, how does it behave? And it's like, no, we really want to focus on what happens if you enter one of something or many of something. How does the system behave in that? And what does the system actually spit out at you? Thinking about how we unit test a system to grow it from that small value to the largest system that we
yeah.
want to put out there.
Yeah, which is great. We got to just experience it as a team when you're like breaking it down again
Yeah.
small. It's one thing we know we can move forward.
So
Well,
you brought up software craft a little bit, and we didn't really get into much of that, but I would recommend there's a number of software craft meetups that meet virtually still. Calgary Software Crafters, Seattle Software Crafters. I think there's a Boston group, there's a Philly Extreme Programming group. That would be a great way to start getting integrated in this community and hear what they're worried about, what they're learning. I think the distinction is that as a developer, as an engineer, you tend to focus on languages and frameworks and things that are really very detailed oriented. But the craft is more about how do we put the system together. It's that metaphor of in the old days, we had the guilds where somebody would apprentice with someone, and after a certain point of time, they would understand the patterns that they're seeing and how the system behaves. And now they can be said to be a crafts person in this area. And that's what we're talking about with the software craft is that it's really like it's not just the language and the computer I'm working on, it's more of how does the system get put together. Is this something that I could be standing behind proud of, or is it just something that I threw over the wall and it's not my problem anymore?
yeah, I like that. Good highlight. So for those who are listening to the video or watching it, we'll make sure and put those links to
Yeah.
the areas that Paul mentioned. You might want to start with Seattle and not the Boston one. People in Boston can be, kind of rough around the edge. So you move your way from west to east and then
Uh-huh.
see how that goes. Well, Paul, thanks for the time. If you're curious about anything else that Paul had mentioned regarding those classes, you can go to the website, Rocket9 Solutions, and you'll see the classes that are listed, whether that's Certified Scrum Developer, Advanced Certified Scrum Developer, the behavior-driven development, lean engineering, or even just to have a one-on-one to just set up a time and discuss what challenge or situation you're facing. And we're happy to just kind of walk through what we've seen and what Paul might recommend as a way forward for anyone that's watching those. Thank you,
All right.
Paul. Hope to see you
Cool.
soon.
Great. Thanks, Scott.